So dear children of God, aren't vacations great? I kind of feel uniquely qualified to talk about that, having just come back about 36 hours ago. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, it's good to have some downtime, isn't it? But there's also a bad thing about vacations, and almost every vacation suffers from this affliction, suffers from this disease, and the evidence of this disease is the fact that I'm back here up in front talking to you again today. All vacations come to an end. And what happens when a vacation comes to an end is you have to go back to work, you have to go back to real life, you have to go back to the day-to-day grind of existence. And so, do you sometimes wish that there was a vacation and there was a kind of rest that just never came to an end? Well, what if I told you that Jesus came actually to bring you that kind of rest, to bring you that kind of vacation, a rest that never expires, a rest that never wears out, a rest that never gets old? Would you want to learn more about that? I think so, right? Well, today as we dig into this gospel lesson, we'll see just how Jesus does this, how following Jesus leads to real rest. Now, today's account, this takes place on the Sabbath day. It was an important day in Jewish life. We heard it commanded earlier in that Old Testament lesson. 6 days they were to work, and the seventh day they were to rest, but not just the people. It was everyone in the whole household, including the animals that would have pulled the plows out in the field. They all were to rest. And that's what the word Sabbath actually means. It means rest. It was to be a day of rest for everyone. Well, on this particular day, it was a Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field, and as they walk along, the disciples plucked a few heads of grain as they walked through that field. And then the Pharisees, the supposed moral compass of that society, picked up on this and immediately questioned Jesus, "Why are your disciples doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath day?" You see, their accusation was not that it was wrong for them to pick those heads of grain as they walked through the field. That was actually right and proper. There was a provision in their law that stated just that. But their accusation was that it was wrong to do that on the Sabbath day. You see, what the Jewish religious tradition had done is they sought to carefully define and descriptively nail down what God exactly meant with every one of the commands that he gave. And so for this command, remember the Sabbath day, they said, well, what does it mean to work? And so they developed 39 different classifications of work, all of which were forbidden on the Sabbath day. And so in their mind, the disciples, as they picked those heads of grain, were harvesting, and harvesting is forbidden on the Sabbath day. So how could Jesus allow his disciples to so blatantly break that Sabbath command? But there was something big missing in the Pharisees' understanding. And Jesus pointed it out by directing them to an event in their history, an event that was recorded in the scriptures. He says, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat." So he refers to a time when David, before he was King David that we know him as, was on the run for his life. He and his men needed food, and so they went to one of the only safe places they knew. They went to the house of God, and they asked the high priest if he had any food to spare. Well, the only food that the high priest had was the bread that was set aside for religious use, a bread that normally was only allowed for those priests to eat. Well, the priest said, "Here, this is all I have, take it, you guys need it." Well, what the high priest did by giving out that bread, and what David and his men did by eating that bread, technically it was wrong, yet they weren't actually guilty of wrongdoing. And it gets down to the spirit or the deeper purpose for why God had given that command. You see, the rule that in that case only the priests were to eat that bread, that was not intended to form grounds to turn away people who were in need, people who were hungry and in need of food. And that's the point that Jesus brings out loud and clear when he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What Jesus is saying is that the Sabbath was never meant to make people go hungry one day a week. You know, that command to take a day off of work was not meant to bar people from having the things that they need. No, it was given by God to serve us. Given to serve us, not to enslave us to its ritualistic observance. So a day when work was forbidden was given for our benefit. It was given to be a blessing to us. Now, God gave this command 3,500 years ago. He gave this command to a society of farmers, ranchers, shepherds, tradesmen, people for whom the work could seemingly never stop. There's always a reason to go out and check on the herds. There's always a reason to check on the fields. There's always some work to be done. But God told them, he commanded them to take one day off of work every day of the week. Now fast forward to today. Recent studies have actually overwhelmingly shown the benefits, the health benefits that come from taking time off of work and the health risks that come with not getting enough time off work. 2013, an article published in Scientific American stated that many important mental processes seem to require what we call downtime and other forms of rest. Downtime replenishes the brain's stores of attention and motivation and encourages productivity and creativity and is essential to achieve our highest levels of performance. And then the same year, CNN published an interview with a doctor. His name was Matthew Sleeth, and this doctor says this. He says, "We go 24/7 now, and it's having health consequences. I think more and more there's a consensus that it leads to depression and anxiety. When we're constantly we pour out chemicals to meet those stresses. We have short-term stress hormones like adrenaline and longer-term hormones like the steroids that we pour out. Those chemicals constantly being on are bad for us, and they lead to anxiety and depression." And so all this leads us to say, well, do you think God knew something 3,500 years ago when he commanded his people to take a day off work every week? Certainly he did. The Sabbath was made for man. It was made to be a blessing to us. And so the point that Jesus brings out loud and clear for all of us here is that there is a right understanding of God's law to be had by all of us. It's easy to look at the law of God and the will of God and the commands of God and to see them just as a burden, something given to, take the fun out of life and so on. But the reality is that nothing can be further from the truth. If you look at every single one of God's moral commands or God's moral prohibitions, you can, without a lot of hard work, without a lot of thinking, see how that command is meant to be for our good. I mean, just take a random sampling of the commands that come to your mind. He tells us to honor our father and mother. Why does he do that? Because he knows that children won't live to be 18 if they don't learn to listen to mom and dad when they tell them not to run in the street. Why does he tell husbands and wives to honor one another in marriage? Not because he wants to limit our sexual freedom, as our society today would say, but because he knows that our life is healthier and happier when things are good at home. Why does he tell us not to get drunk? Well, because he knows that, it's not because he doesn't want us to relax and have a good time, but rather because he knows that when we've had too much to drink, we tend to make poor decisions that hurt us and that hurt other people in our lives, and not to mention that it's bad for us. See, Jesus makes clear that God's laws and commands were given for our good. And that's the first way that we see him giving us real rest, because he gives us a right understanding of God's law. It's not meant to enslave us. It's not meant to burden us, but it's given to serve us, given for our good. And so the question for all of us to think about is, how do you view God's laws? How do you view his commands? Do you see them as a burden? If you do, or maybe probably better to say when you see them as a burden, realize that you're not looking at them right. You're not thinking about them right if that's how you're seeing them. They aren't meant to be a burden. They aren't meant to be a hard. They're not meant to be a struggle to want to keep them, but yet so often they are, right? So why is it? Why is it that something that God has given us for our good, that we end up seeing it so much as a struggle? Well, first of all, it shows the character of our sinful nature. In Romans chapter 8, it says, "The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so." So what our sinful nature does is it takes something that God has given us to bless us, that God has given for our good, and then it leads us to see in it the opposite. It leads us to see in it an arbitrary, capricious God who wants to take the fun out of life. So no, when you think that way, when you see God's commands and laws that way, that's your sinful nature talking to you. That's not what those laws were meant to be. But secondly, we can see those laws as a burden because we naturally tend to view them as either a stepping stone or a tool to prove our acceptability, a tool to prove our worth and status before God and other people. See, if we're using the laws of God to prove our worth, to prove our status, then it's always going to be a harsh taskmaster. It's always going to tell you something that you haven't done quite right. It's going to tell you something more that you need to do, some part your life that you need to fix and improve. You see, we can work and work and work trying to prove to ourselves that we're good people, trying to justify our worthiness before God, or trying to convince other people in our life, that I'm all right, that I'm a decent person, but that work is never finished because we're never sure if we've done enough or that we've done enough well enough. The only way that we can rest is if we know that the work is done, and it's done completely, and it's done perfectly. When God created the world, he did it in 6 days. And what did he do on the seventh day? He rested. Well, why did he rest? Was it because he was tired? Well, he's God. He created the world at the sound of his voice. There's no way he was tired. He rested because the world he created was perfect, and it was done. Now, as it says at the end of the creation, God looked out on all that he had made, and it was very good. That's why he rested. But see, the problem with all of our work is that it's never perfect. It's never perfect, and we know it. As an example of this playing out in real life, in our house in Washington that we lived in, when we bought the house, I joked that it was a tribute to 1975, because you walked in and it was like a trip back in time. Carpet, lighting, everything. Well, one of the many projects I did on that house was laying laminate flooring in several rooms of the house. Now, lay a room full of flooring, friends and neighbors eventually come and they see, oh, that looks great. But you know what I see when I'd walk into the room? I'd see, these three places where the floor didn't quite come together just right the way I wanted it to. Or I see that place over there, where I cut the plank just a hair too short and I tried to cover it up, but it's noticeable to me because I know that it's there. Well, why is that? Well, because no matter how hard we try at our work, it's never perfect. We never do enough well enough. Well, the same happens in our moral efforts. We always have this feeling that there's something left to do, that there's something left to prove. And if we're using God's laws and commands to try and accomplish that, you never have rest, because you're always going to find a flaw. You're always going to end up finding a place that you didn't do enough and you didn't do it well enough. And then on top of that, what happens is you often end up resenting God for giving you those commands that were intended to bless you. But because we don't keep them, we end up resenting him and hating him for putting those obstacles in our path to achieving what we want to achieve. The only way that we can have real rest is not through striving, not through achieving, but it's in Jesus Christ. And that's why he said the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So when he said that, he was declaring his ability to understand and to authoritatively teach about the Sabbath day and what it meant. But he's saying more than just that. He's declaring that he is the Lord of real rest, and that he came to bring us a rest, a deeper rest than what we get from just a day off of work. That he came to bring you rest for your soul. He came to bring you rest from the work that's beneath all of our work, that work of trying to prove ourselves worthy before God and others. And he brings you that rest by keeping all of God's law, all 100% of it, keeping it all perfectly, from the intent of the law all the way on out to the action of the law. He always saw that law every day of his life, every command of God. He always saw it as a blessing, something that God had given him for his good. And when he did that, he did it all completely, he did it all perfectly, and he did it all for you. That work is finished, and it is complete, and it is done. And then on the cross, when Jesus died, he suffered and died for every last time that we've disobeyed. All the times that we've treated his law like a burden to carry, or that burden that takes the fun out of life, all the times we've treated his law like a stepping stone instead of as a yes. He died for all of it, and because of that, you're forgiven, you're restored, you're declared to be worthy and blameless and acceptable to God, all by the saving work of Jesus, all by his perfect life that he lived in your place, and all by his death that he died in your place. And so that's how he gives you real rest. At the end of his great act of creation, God, in a sense, looked out on all that he made and he said, "It is finished," and he rested. At the end of his great act of redemption, Jesus literally said, "It is finished." But he didn't rest. Because of what he did, we can rest. See, only when you rest in Jesus and his saving work for you, that's how you have a rest that lasts forever. That's how you have that rest that never comes to an end. So following Jesus leads to real rest. And see, when we're resting in Jesus, then we're more ready to find the good purpose that God gives us in his law, because a God who saves you is a God who loves you, and a God who would never give you anything that's bad for you, and a God who would only give you things that are good for you. When we're resting in Jesus, that frees us then to have joy in God's law, because the burden to use it to prove yourself is gone. It's lifted and it's taken away forever. And so then you're free to follow that law out of love and thanks rather than out of obligation. And when you're resting in Jesus, you're free to seek out and to find the deep virtue that God is after in the law, rather than needing every last detail of that law and command spelled out, because you're secure enough in your own righteousness and status before Him that you're okay dealing with a little bit of moral ambiguity that naturally comes, because you know that you're right with God, not by your achievement, but by what Jesus has achieved for you. Well, following Jesus leads to real rest. And that's also the good reason why God tells us to remember the Sabbath day. As we heard in our lesson from Colossians, our observance of this day is not tied to a specific day of the week as it was for the Jews. Rather, our command, as we have it, is still to make regular time to rest from our work, and then in that time to rest in the saving work of Jesus as we hear it in His Word. And that's why when Martin Luther explained this commandment, he centered that explanation around hearing and learning God's Word. He said we should fear and love God, that we do not despise preaching in His Word, but rather regard that Word as holy and gladly hear and learn it. You see, God commands us to hear His Word because it's through that Word that we rest in Jesus and His righteousness. So yeah, vacations are great. Rest for our bodies is good and it's necessary, but we need a deeper rest than that. And following Jesus leads us to real rest. Because only in Jesus do we gain a right understanding of God's law, that it was given for our good. But more importantly, only in Jesus are we given eternal rest for our souls. So may we always rest in Him.